Amos Fisher stood at the tailgate of a truck that did not belong to him, watching 11 plastic bins of ruined strawberries slide toward him on a hand truck that squealed with every turn of its wheel. The berries were split along their shoulders where the June rain had swelled them too fast, soft in patches where the sun had gotten to them a day too long on the vine, some no bigger than a thumbnail, and rejected for that alone. This was cull fruit, the kind sorted out at the packing shed before a single quart ever reached a grocery shelf, the kind Dale Hutchins normally paid a hauler $40 a load to take to the county landfill, because even the hog farmers had stopped wanting it. Hutchins stood with one boot up on the truck's running board, arms crossed, watching an Amish man in a straw hat and suspenders count out cash for garbage. "You understand these aren't worth what you're paying me," Hutchins said. "Fruit's done. It's not going to get less rotten sitting in your barn." Amos did not answer that. He finished counting the bills, folded the rest back into his coat pocket, and began loading the bins onto his wagon one at a time, testing the weight of each with a short lift before setting it down, which was not something a man does with garbage, though nobody standing in that lot seemed to notice it but him. A younger hand from the berry farm laughed and said something to another about pig slop for people who didn't have pigs, and Hutchins laughed along, not unkindly exactly, the way men laugh when they believe they already know how a thing ends. Amos Fisher latched the tailgate of his wagon, checked the hitch on his horse, and drove out of the lot without turning around, which some of them would remember later as strange, and some would remember as exactly what they expected from him, and both of those memories would turn out to be true at once. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. Amos Fisher was 38 years old that June, a widower for going on 2 years, a fact the county knew and did not discuss with him directly, the way a community learns to step around a hole in a floor without ever agreeing out loud on where the hole is. His wife Rachel had died in the spring 2 years before this story starts, and what happened was not something anyone talked through in any detail. Not even Amos, who kept his grief the way he kept most things, which was privately, on paper, in a ledger that no one but him read. He farmed 41 acres on the east side of the township, mostly hay and a stand of apple trees his grandfather had planted the year Eisenhower left office, along with 6 hives of bees he tended for the honey and for the orchard's sake, since a hive does more work for an apple tree than any man with a paintbrush ever could. He was old order, which meant no truck of his own and no wire running to his house, no radio, no tractor beyond the horse-drawn kind, and a phone shanty at the end of his lane that rang maybe twice a week and was answered maybe half of those times. He was known around the county as a careful man rather than a friendly one, which in a farming county is usually meant as a compliment, and sometimes is not. What brought him to Hutchins Berry Farm that June was not the berries themselves, but a stretch of pages in his grandfather's farm journal, a book bound in oilcloth that had sat on a shelf in the spring house for 11 years since the old man's death, untouched by anyone because nobody had needed anything from it. Amos had read parts of it before, the way you read something you already believe you understand, skimming for weather notes and planting dates. But that spring, sorting through the spring house to clear space for a new cheese press, he had sat down on an overturned bucket and read the whole thing straight through for the first time, cover to cover, in the slow, deliberate way his grandfather Elias Fisher had clearly intended it to be read by whoever eventually needed it. Near the back, in a section about preserving, under a heading that simply said fruit, there was a line that Amos read 3 times before he understood it was not a passing comment, but an instruction. Culled don't mean spoiled, his grandfather had written, in the small slanted hand he used for anything he considered important enough to underline. It only means the packer stopped looking. Sort with the hand, not the eye, and cook it before you count it lost. Amos sat with that sentence a long while. He had grown up hearing his grandfather say versions of it about other things, about lumber and about livestock and about land that neighbors had given up on. But he had never applied it to fruit, because fruit was the one crop nobody in the county treated as anything but disposable once it failed to look perfect. He knew, from years of buying jam at the county store for lack of a wife to make it, that most preserves on the shelf were made from good ripe berries with sugar and store-bought pectin added to force a set, and that the whole industry around fruit treated blemished stock as waste rather than raw material. What his grandfather's note suggested, and what Amos began turning over for the better part of 2 months before he ever drove to Hutchins's farm, was a different premise entirely. That a bin of rejected strawberries was not a bin of bad fruit. It was a bin of fruit at every stage of ripeness, including some still slightly underripe, rejected not because they were spoiled, but because a machine or a hurried set of hands had judged them by color and size and shape rather than by what was actually happening inside them. And that underripe fruit carried more natural pectin than fully ripe fruit did, which meant a jam made honestly from Cull-grade strawberries, sorted carefully by hand instead of judged by eye from a distance, might set on its own, the way jam had been made before anyone thought to buy pectin in a box. This was the anomaly nobody else had checked, because nobody else had any reason to check it. Berry farmers wanted their culls gone, not studied. Jam makers wanted pretty, ripe fruit, because pretty fruit made a marketable label. The idea that the reject pile held something the good pile did not was not a thought that occurred to people who were paid to stop looking at the reject pile the moment it left their hands. Before Amos ever loaded a bin onto his wagon, he spent the better part of 6 weeks in preparation that nobody in the township saw or asked about, which was exactly how he preferred to work. He scrubbed out his grandmother's old copper kettle, unused since her death a decade before his grandfather's, a kettle he had started calling copper without meaning to, the way a man will give a name to the one tool he trusts most, and no other. He tested batches on a smaller scale first, using bruised fruit from his own trees and from a neighbor's discard pile, timing how long a low-sugar batch took to reach a set, using nothing but the pectin already present, in a mix of ripe and just underripe fruit, recording every trial by hand in a new ledger he started specifically for the purpose, dated from the first page. He built simple wooden sorting trays with mesh bottoms so bruised juice could drain away from firm fruit rather than soaking into it, a trick his grandfather's journal mentioned in half a sentence that Amos had to read 4 times before he understood what it meant. He located, through a letter to the county extension office, the exact temperature range at which a natural pectin set held without scorching, and he wrote that number on a card and nailed the card above the stove. Only after all of that, after weeks nobody else in the township witnessed, did he drive to Hutchins' Berry Farm and ask, plainly, to buy the culls that would otherwise be hauled to the landfill. The gathering place in that part of the county was Zimmerman's Country Store, a combination feed store and grocery, with a counter at the back where men who had finished their morning work stood around a coffee pot that never seemed to empty, and never seemed particularly fresh either. Carl Detweiler, a retired dairyman who had opinions the way other men had hobbies, was the first to bring word of what Amos Fisher had done, having heard it secondhand from one of Hutchins' hands. "He's paying good money for garbage berries," Carl said, setting his coffee down for emphasis. Paying for them, Patty Nolan, who ran the register and heard more real news in a day than the county paper printed in a month, asked what on earth he wanted with them, and Carl said nobody rightly knew, though his own guess was pig feed, since the Fishers had kept hogs once, years back. Frank Ostrander, who farmed the section next to Amos's and considered himself something of an authority on the man simply by proximity, said he'd heard it wasn't for hogs at all, that Fisher didn't keep hogs anymore, and that whatever he wanted with a truckload of split fruit was his own business, though Frank said this in the tone of a man who found the whole idea faintly embarrassing on Amos's behalf. By the end of that first week, the story circulating at Zimmerman's counter had settled into something close to a joke, and somebody, nobody could later agree who, had started calling it the Berry Fools Project, a name that stuck fast the way unkind names do in small places, repeated at the counter, with a little laugh that was not cruel so much as certain, the certainty of people who believed they had already seen how this would end. Amos heard about the nickname secondhand, the way a man in his position always does, and he did not respond to it in any way that reached the counter, which some took as dignity, and some took as simply not having heard clearly. He kept driving to Hutchins' Berry Farm twice a week that first month, buying whatever culls Hutchins was willing to sell, rather than dump, at a price that made no sense to Hutchins beyond the fact that it was free money for something he'd otherwise pay to haul away. Hutchins himself found the whole business mildly entertaining, and said as much to anyone who asked, telling the story of the Amish man and his cache at the tailgate the way a man tells a story about weather, something that happened to him, rather than because of him, without any particular stake in how it turned out. The work itself, once the fruit reached Amos's kitchen, was slower and more exacting than anyone at Zimmerman's counter would have guessed, had any of them bothered to look. Each bin was tipped out onto the mesh trays and sorted by hand, a process that took the better part of 2 hours per 11 bin delivery. Separating fruit that was merely blemished from fruit that had gone soft with true rot, a distinction his grandfather's note had insisted on, and that Amos found, in practice, took real attention to make correctly. Sort with the hand, not the eye. A berry that looked disqualifying from 3 feet away often felt entirely sound between 2 fingers, firm and cool and only cosmetically marked, while a berry that looked fine from a distance sometimes gave under the slightest pressure, already collapsing from within. This was not romantic work. It was repetitive, and his fingers stained red through the whole of July, and more than once he found himself standing at the trays at 10 at night, finishing a batch by lamplight, because the fruit would not wait for morning. But it was, in its way, the same kind of attention his grandfather had always paid to soil and to timber and to the character of a young horse before buying it, an attention that assumed nothing was as simple as its surface suggested until it had been checked by hand. His first written record from that summer, dated July the 3rd, read, 11 bins today. Hutchins didn't count them, just waved me off the scale. Sorted 4 hours. Good fruit mixed in with the bad, more than I expected. Maybe 1 bin in 4 fit only for compost. Kept notes on the rest. He began recording not just yields but set times, temperatures, and outcomes, the way his grandfather had recorded rainfall and planting dates decades before, understanding without being told that a record kept faithfully was worth more the longer it ran, and that whoever came after him, whether that was a son he did not yet have or simply his own future self on a harder day, would need the numbers more than they would need his memory of how the numbers felt. Losses came honestly, and were recorded just as honestly. An entry from July the 9th noted that a full bin, roughly 40 pounds, had turned before he could process it, left too long in the heat of the wagon bed on the drive home. A mistake he attributed plainly to himself, and corrected the following week by leaving earlier in the morning and packing the bins with ice from the springhouse for the ride. Another entry, from July the 16th, recorded that a batch cooked too long had turned to something closer to candy than jam, unsellable, and that he had fed it to the bees rather than waste it entirely, which was its own kind of practical mercy. He did not write these entries with any apparent frustration. They were simply what had happened, set down the way weather is set down, without argument. The first private evidence that something in his grandfather's premise was correct came on July the 14th, when a batch made from a deliberately uneven mix, 2/3 ripe fruit to 1/3 just underripe, reached a full set at 18 hours without a single spoonful of added pectin, tested the old way, by dropping a spoonful onto a chilled plate and watching whether it held its shape or ran. It held. Amos wrote the time and the ratio down twice in the ledger, once in the body of the entry, and once again underlined at the bottom of the page, which was, for a man who did not gesture much, close to a shout. He did not tell anyone at Zimmerman's. He did not tell Hutchins. He put up 40 jars that first batch, and gave most of them away to neighbors who had helped him at haying time the year before. The kind of quiet repayment that asked for nothing and revealed nothing about what he'd actually discovered. It was Verna Esch who first understood what he was building, because Verna was the one person Amos brought into the kitchen with him that summer. a widow 2 farms over whose husband had died in a hay wagon accident the previous fall, leaving her with 3 children and a debt on machinery she could not use and would not sell out of stubbornness, or grief, or both. Amos had known her only distantly before that summer, the way neighbors in a small church district know each other, but he offered her the sorting and labeling work at a fair wage once the volume outgrew what he could manage alone. And Verna, who needed the income and turned out to have a sharper eye for a bruise than Amos himself did within 2 weeks, became the second set of hands the operation quietly depended on. It was Verna who noticed, cutting the caps off a batch of berries one afternoon in early August, that a good number of the smallest and least attractive culls, the ones Hutchins's own sorting line rejected purely for size, had thicker skins and firmer flesh than the larger ripe fruit, and held their shape through the cooking better, giving the finished jam a texture closer to whole preserved fruit than to the smooth, cooked-down spread most people expected. She caught the trick with the skins faster than I did, Amos wrote in the ledger that week, which for him amounted to a compliment stated as fact rather than sentiment. By August, the county waiting list, if it could be called that yet, was really just a scrap of paper with 11 names on it, neighbors and cousins, and one schoolteacher from the district who had tasted a jar at a potluck and asked, with real surprise in her voice, whether it had pectin in it, since it set firmer than anything she bought at the store. Amos told her, plainly, that it did not, that the fruit provided its own, and she asked to buy 2 jars on the spot, which he sold her at a price that barely covered his sugar in jars but which he recorded anyway, in a new column he'd started for sales, because a number written down was a number that existed, and a number not written down was, in his grandfather's old accounting, close to a number that had never happened at all. The visit that changed how the county talked about Amos Fisher's project came in September, when word reached the State Agricultural Extension Office that an Amish man in the township was selling home-canned preserves made from unlicensed cull fruit without any clear food safety process behind it. A report that had almost certainly originated at Zimmerman's counter in some form, though nobody ever admitted to placing the call. The inspector who arrived, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had spent 11 years testing pH levels and processing times for cottage food operations across 3 counties, came to Amos's kitchen expecting, by her own later admission, to find exactly the kind of casual, underprepared operation the complaint had described. What she found instead was a ledger. Carol Whitfield stood at Amos's kitchen table that afternoon and read through 2 months of dated entries, batch temperatures, processing times, pH readings Amos had taken himself using strips ordered by mail after his letter to the extension office months earlier, jar counts, and set times recorded to the hour. From the dumpster? She asked him at one point, having pieced together that the fruit itself came from Hutchins's rejects. From the dumpster, Amos said. She was quiet for a moment. She tested 3 jars from his current batch against her own equipment, checking sugar content and acidity against the safe range for shelf-stable preserving, and found every one of them within margin, not by luck but by a process that had clearly been tuned, batch after batch, against exactly the standards she was there to enforce. She asked how long he had been keeping records like this. Since the first batch, he told her. She asked why. It seemed like the kind of thing you'd want to know later, he said, and did not elaborate further, which was as close as Amos Fisher ever came to explaining himself to anyone. Carol Whitfield closed her folder, told him his process met every standard she was required to check, noted that most licensed commercial kitchens she inspected kept worse records than his handwritten ledger, and scheduled a routine follow-up for the following spring, rather than any further action, a small bureaucratic mercy that nonetheless amounted, in the language of the county, to a clean bill delivered by an outsider nobody could accuse of favoritism. Word of the inspection traveled through Zimmerman's counter within 2 days, transformed along the way, in the manner these stories always were. Carl Detweiler told it as a near miss, the state nearly shutting Fisher down. Patty Nolan told it, closer to the truth, as the inspector finding nothing wrong at all. Frank Ostrander, who by now had eaten 2 jars of the jam himself, courtesy of his wife trading eggs for them, allowed that whatever Fisher was doing back there, he seemed to be doing it carefully, a small revision in language that would have been unthinkable at the counter in July. The nickname did not disappear yet. But it changed shape, spoken now with a faint question mark in it rather than a period, the tone people use when their expectation has been revised faster than their language has caught up to admit it. The true test came the following June, almost exactly a year after the first 11 bins had come off Hutchins's truck, in a stretch of weather the county would talk about for years afterward, simply as the wet June. 4 inches of rain fell in 3 days at the peak of the strawberry harvest across the whole growing region, splitting fruit on the vine faster than any picking crew could bring it in ahead of the damage, and by the second morning nearly every berry farm in 3 counties was staring at fields where 60 to 70% of what should have been marketable fruit had cracked, softened, or begun to mold on the stem. Hutchins' berry farm alone lost close to 2/3 of its projected crop that week, a loss Dale Hutchins described to anyone who would listen as the worst he'd seen in 18 years of growing, and for the first time since Amos had started buying his culls, Hutchins had no market at all for what remained. No hauler willing to take the volume, no hog operation nearby wanting truckloads of wet, splitting fruit that would spoil within a day. Amos drove to the farm himself the second morning of the rain, before the water had even fully drained from the rows, and told Hutchins plainly that he would take everything the farm could bring him. Every bin, at the same price he had always paid, provided it reached his barn within 2 days of picking, since his grandfather's old note about cooking it before you count it lost had, over a year of trial, revealed itself to have a hard outer limit of roughly 49 hours before splitting fruit tipped from salvageable into truly spoiled. Hutchins looked at him for a long moment in the rain, water running off the brim of Amos's hat, and said, "You want all of it?" Amos said he did. It was, by any measure Hutchins had ever used to judge a man, an absurd offer, made at a moment when Hutchins had nothing to lose by accepting it and everything to gain, and he took it without further argument, which was its own kind of small confession. What followed was the hardest and busiest 10 days of Amos Fisher's life to that point, sorting and cooking around the clock with Verna, and, by the 4th day, 2 of her older children brought in to help with washing and capping, running copper on the stove in shifts that stretched past midnight, tracking every batch against the 49-hour window in a ledger that filled 3 times faster than any previous week had. He processed, by his own final count that season, over 4,000 pounds of fruit that would otherwise have rotted in the fields or been bulldozed under, at a time when every other preserving operation in the county, commercial or otherwise, was either overwhelmed or simply unequipped to handle volume of damaged fruit on that scale. The contrast, once the rain finally broke, was visible from the road in the plainest possible sense. Berry fields sitting fallow and stripped of anything worth harvesting up and down the county highway, and at the same time a steady line of trucks and buggies turning up Amos Fisher's lane, delivering fruit that a year earlier nobody would have paid to have hauled away. It was in the second week of that wet June that Dale Hutchins came to Amos's barn, not with a truckload of berries, but alone, in the evening, after the day's deliveries had stopped. He stood in the doorway for a moment, before Amos noticed him. "I was wrong about you," Hutchins said. That was all. He did not elaborate, and Amos did not ask him to. "You were working from what you could see," Amos said, which was true, and which was also, in its way, the most generous thing he could have offered back, refusing the shape of victory, even when it was plainly his to take. Hutchins nodded once, looked at the rows of jars cooling on the counter behind Amos, and asked, without much hope in his voice, whether Amos would be willing to take on the following year's culls under a standing arrangement rather than a truck-by-truck sale. Amos said he would think on it, which he did, and which by August had become exactly that, a standing arrangement, the first of its kind either man had ever put in writing. By the time the wet June had passed fully into memory, the language at Zimmerman's counter had changed in a way even Carl Detweiler could not fully argue against. The Berry Fools Project, a name that had once been spoken with a laugh, was now spoken, when it was spoken at all, as Fisher's operation, a term with no laugh attached to it whatsoever. Frank Ostrander, who had once found the whole business faintly embarrassing on Amos's behalf, drove over one August afternoon, not to buy jam, but to ask plainly whether Amos would show him how the sorting trays were built, since Frank had a fair amount of drop fruit off his own trees each fall that he'd simply been letting go to waste. Amos built him a set that same week and walked him through the mesh and drainage angle without charging him for either the material or the time, which was, in the accounting that mattered most to Amos, its own kind of interest paid on a debt he felt he owed the county for having doubted him honestly rather than maliciously. The waiting list, which had stood at 11 names the previous August, had grown by the following spring to 47, largely on word of mouth after the wet June story made its way, in the peculiar manner of small counties, into conversation 2 towns over. By the spring after that, it stood at 211 names, a number Amos recorded in the ledger, with the same flat hand he used for a bushel count or a batch temperature, though he did, that once, put a single underline beneath it before closing the book, which was as close as he ever came to marking an occasion. It was that spring that Nathan Pierce first wrote to the phone, "Shanty," a letter, rather than a call, since he understood, from asking around, that a letter had a better chance of reaching Amos Fisher promptly than a ringing phone at the end of an empty lane. Pierce ran a specialty grocery and small regional distribution business out of the city, supplying gourmet shops and a handful of upscale restaurants with preserves, cheeses, and honey sourced from small producers within a day's drive. And he had heard about the county waiting list from a cousin who lived nearby and had, after several failed attempts, finally gotten her own name onto it. Pierce drove out himself rather than sending a buyer, tasted 4 jars across 2 visits, tested the set and the acidity with his own kit out of long professional habit, and confirmed for himself what Carol Whitfield had already confirmed the year before, that the jam held a natural set without added pectin, a rarity in the current market, and from a purely commercial standpoint, a genuine point of distinction he believed he could sell hard in the city. Pierce's first offer was for a volume that would have required Amos to more than triple his output, hire several more hands, and very likely bring in machinery of a kind Amos had no interest in owning or operating. Amos read the proposal, sat with it for the better part of a week, and told Pierce plainly, when he came back for an answer, that he would supply him a fixed number of cases each season, no more, at a price Pierce considered generous to himself and Amos considered fair to everyone involved, but that he would not expand the operation beyond what he and Verna and her children could manage by hand, since the whole value of what he made, in his own accounting, was bound up in the sorting itself, and sorting by hand had a ceiling that machinery would only pretend to raise. Pierce, who had expected to negotiate upward, found instead a man entirely unmoved by the prospect of scale, and after a second visit agreed to the fixed arrangement, which he later described to colleagues, with a kind of professional admiration, as the only supplier he'd ever worked with who had turned down more money on principle rather than asked for it. The ripple beyond Amos's own barn came slowly, the way these things do in a county that measures trust in years rather than seasons. Frank Ostrander's drop fruit operation, small as it was, produced its first modest batch of pear, preserves that same autumn using trays built off Amos's design, and gave most of it away at church the way Amos had once given away his own first batch. A young English couple who had bought the old Kessler place 2 farms down, new to growing anything beyond a garden, came to Amos that winter, asking how he decided what fruit was worth saving and what wasn't, and Amos told them what his grandfather had told him, adjusted only slightly in the retelling. Cull doesn't mean spoiled, he said. It just means somebody stopped looking too soon. It was Verna's youngest, a girl of 7 named Ruth, who asked the plainest version of the question one afternoon that same winter, standing at the sorting tray beside her mother and watching Amos test a spoonful of jam on a chilled plate for the 100th time that season. "How do you know it's ready?" she asked, and Amos looked at the plate a moment before answering. "It sets when it's ready to set," he told her. "Not when you want it to. You just have to know how to ask it properly, and then you have to be patient enough to wait for the answer." Ruth considered this with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to a kitchen counter, and went back to sorting berries by hand, the way she had been taught, without asking anything further, which suggested to Amos that she had understood the answer well enough for now, and would understand the rest of it later, the way most things worth knowing arrive in pieces over years, rather than all at once, in a single explanation. That winter, in the quiet stretch between the last of the season's jars and the first thaw, Amos took his grandfather's old journal down from its shelf again, the oilcloth cover soft now from handling, and turned to the last blank page at the back of the section on preserving. He sat with a pen for a long while before writing anything, the way he sat with most decisions, and then wrote a single line beneath the space where his grandfather's slanted hand ended and his own steadier one began. 2 years, 4,000 pounds in the wet June alone, and a waiting list longer than the road it's on. You were right. It only means somebody stopped looking too soon. He closed the book and set it back on the shelf, not in the spring house this time, but in the kitchen, within easy reach, where Verna's children could find it themselves one day, if they ever needed to. The way he had needed to, decades after the man who wrote it had any way of knowing who would eventually read it, or what they would do with what they found. The following spring, when the first bins of the new season's culls came up the lane behind Hutchins's own truck now, rather than a hired hauler's, Amos was already at the barn door before it stopped, checking the weight of the top bin, with the same short lift he had used on the very first delivery 2 years before, a habit that had never left him, and likely never would. He went to check on Duke first, the draft horse who pulled the wagon on Cull delivery days and who had, over 2 years, developed something close to an opinion about the smell of overripe fruit, laying his ears back if a bin sat too long unsorted in the wagon bed, an early warning system Amos had come to trust nearly as much as his own nose. Satisfied that the horse and the fruit were both settled for the morning, he went inside, filled the kettle he still called copper, and set the first batch of the new season to cook, the same slow, exact, unhurried way he had done it from the very first day, before any of it had a name, before there was a list of names waiting for jars, before an inspector or a buyer or a chastened skeptic had ever set foot in his kitchen, back when it was only a man, a journal, and a bin of fruit everyone else had already decided was finished. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told the thing sitting forgotten in their own barn or backyard or garage isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever taken something everybody else had already thrown away and turned it into something worth waiting in line for, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.